sleep, not ever.
Won't. Right, that's it. That's where we are.
The breaking news, because overnight, the president threatening war with Iran, language that raises new concerns, and you can ask yourself why and why now. But this is what the president wrote just before midnight to the Iranian President Rouhani: never, ever threaten the United States again, or you will suffer consequences the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered before. This came in response, we think, to Iran's president saying that Americans must understand that war with Iran would be, quote, the mother of all wars. And if what the president said sounded familiar, let's rewind almost to a year ago when the president said this.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
Okay, so one big question this morning is whether the Iran threat is real or whether it's designed as a distraction from all the criticism about the Helsinki summit that the president has gotten. While the president continues to publicly praise progress with North Korea, a U.S. official tells CNN that Mr. Trump is actually frustrated over the pace of talks with North Korea. And CNN is also reporting this morning that North Korea plans to keep talks with the U.S. going, but they're calling for the U.S. to make more concessions. So we have all of this covered for you. It's been a busy 12 hours. Let's begin with CNN's Nick Payton-Walsh. He is live in London with the president's threat. Nick, what do you have?
Alison, extraordinary to wake up today, and I'll try and emulate the caps lock he left on as I read this tweet out. But to the Iranian President Rouhani, never ever threaten the United States again, or you will suffer the consequences, the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered before. We are no longer a country that will stand for your demented words of violence and death. Be cautious. Now, this is obviously to a region where a caps lock key can mean an awful lot, a lot of volatility there already. This was clearly part of a ratcheting up of tensions over the last 48 hours or so. Hassan Rouhani, in response to tightening sanctions put in by the US that have pulled out of the Iranian nuclear agreement designed to stop it from having nuclear weapons, Hassan Rouhani said that the US should not pull the lion's tail of Iran, and while saying they could have the mother of all peace, also threatening the mother of all wars. That's what Donald Trump seems to be responding to. Mike Pompeo, his Secretary of State, gave a lengthy speech in California where he essentially accused the Iranian government of acting like a mafia, and more importantly pointed out that the government, in his opinion, of Hassan Rouhani, considered comparatively moderate, were actually a wolf in sheep's clothing. They're really actually extremists. Now, the broader issue here, of course, is we have many different flashpoints across the Middle East where words like this could be the tipping point if there was some sort of military misunderstanding. US troops in Syria near Iranian militia. We have Lebanese Hezbollah at the north of Israel that are backed by Iran. So much that could go wrong. Throwing on sort of rhetorical gasoline like this isn't an enormous help. But the broader thing we heard here from Mike Pompeo was the understanding in their mind that there's some sort of liberal option in Iran that could be pursued that would take over from this comparatively moderate government of Rouhani. Instead, sadly, what seems to be happening is the US rhetoric is pushing them closer towards the hardliners, and that's not good, frankly, for anybody. But yes, Alison, a big distraction this morning from Helsinki. Back to you.
It's all so complicated. Nick Payton-Walsh, thank you very much for laying it out for us and explaining it. CNN has learned that President Trump is frustrated with the lack of progress in denuclearization talks with North Korea, and now an official with knowledge of the North Korean position says the regime is calling for the U.S. to make more concessions. CNN's Will Ripley has been to North Korea more than a dozen times. He is live for us in Hong Kong with more. What have you learned, Will?
Allison, I spoke with a source overnight who says the North Koreans feel they have done enough by claiming they blew up their nuclear test site, something we couldn't verify as journalists on the ground, by freezing missile and nuclear tests since last November, and by possibly returning what they claim are the remains of U.S. service members of the Korean War. In the coming days, the North Koreans say now it's time for the U.S. to make what they call a bold step by lifting sanctions immediately as part of a step-by-step process of denuclearization, and also, perhaps more importantly, by the U.S. pushing for a peace treaty to formally end the Korean War, which the North Koreans feel would guarantee the survival of Kim Jong-un's regime. The North Koreans say they are committed to denuclearization talks with the United States, but my source says that if the U.S. does not push forward quickly with this peace treaty, they're not going to rule out walking away from the negotiating table, from throwing out what was accomplished at the Singapore summit with President Trump. And what is emboldening the North Koreans right now is that even though things with the U.S. have stalled, even though Mike Pompeo got snubbed by North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un when he visited Pyongyang earlier this month. Things are going very well between the North Koreans and their traditional allies, China and Russia, who have told Kim Jong-un they have his back, even if things with the United States don't go his way. That's where we're at right now, John, and we'll see what happens. But clearly a disappointment for the Trump administration with everything else happening as well.
All right, Will Ripley for us in Hong Kong on the North Korea situation. We're going to talk about that and so much more. Joining us now is Richard Clark, the former U.S. National Coordinator for Security, Infrastructure, and Protection and Counterterrorism. Richard, thank you so much for being with us. We have a lot to talk about. What I'd like to do, if we can, is start biggest of big picture and then go down to these separate little crises, which are all seeming to pop up all over the place. But just biggest of big picture. The president met with Vladimir Putin last week and basically had to explain it for 6 days afterwards, walking back the walk back. President Trump doesn't seem to be getting what he wants out of North Korea. And this morning, President Trump lashing out with this verbiage at Iran. Big picture. What does this tell you about the U.S. role in the world right now?
Well, it's diminishing. And the U.S. influence is diminishing. And the overriding thing that connects all of this is diplomatic malpractice by the President of the United States. He is trying to do diplomacy, high-stakes diplomacy, in multiple arenas, himself, shooting from the hip. This is a man who has no experience in national security, no experience in international diplomacy, who's ignoring his advisors. And we see the results. Our influence, our respect around the world is diminishing. The prospects of war are inching up because of his tweets, because of his impulse, because of his lack of experience and his insistence on doing it himself.
Is there a coherence, though, in what he is pursuing? He will say, and he said going back to his inauguration, this is about America first.
No, there's no coherence. He's trying to get a nuclear deal with North Korea, and he threw out a very good nuclear deal with Iran. Basically, his philosophy is if Obama did it, it's wrong. And if Obama didn't do it, maybe there's some place for me to make history. It's all about him. It's not about security. It's not about international stability.
Let's walk through some of the things that have just happened in the last 24 hours. Number one, we woke up to the president's language about Iran, threatening that Iran will suffer consequences the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered before. When you woke up this morning with the rest of us and saw that, what was your reaction?
But John, this comes in context. This comes at a time when Israel and Iran are inching closer to war with each other than they ever have before. And for us to pour gasoline on that fire is very dangerous. You know, if there's a war a year from now or 6 months from now, historians go back and ask, what contributed to that war? They're going to say, among other things, the President of the United States fanning the flames.
But do you think, though, that people just look at this? You say this type of language could fan the flames and cause a war ultimately. Presidents talked like this before about a lot of things. Do you think people at this point just take it as words?
Well, some people do. But some people in Iran, the hardliners, are using this as justification to get ready for war. And when both sides start getting ready for war, the chances of a mistake or a small incident happening and that expanding quickly go up.
Iran, though, is a bad actor on the world stage.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Iran has been doing terrorism in support of insurgencies throughout the Middle East. And that's one of the reasons we have to be careful. They are now more powerful in the Middle East than they have ever been. A war with Iran could not be limited. It could not be small. It would touch Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and throughout the Persian Gulf.
One of the people who theoretically could help the United States to rein in Iran would be Vladimir Putin.
I don't think so. I don't think Putin has a lot of influence over Iran. He never really has. In fact, there are underlying reasons why the two of them don't like each other that go back historically. I don't think the way to rein in Iran is to tweet in all caps that you're going to go to war with them. The way to avoid war with Iran is to try to negotiate with them. And we had done that painfully over several years. And this president threw all of that away.
We were talking about Vladimir Putin. You don't think he has the ability to perhaps rein in Iran. Then how do you explain what the president of the United States has tried to do over the last 8 days with the leader of Russia?
Well, who knows what he tried to do, John? We do not know to this day what went on in those secret one-on-one talks in Helsinki.
Normally, and you've worked in the intelligence community and foreign policy for decades, would you know by now what happened in a presidential summit?
You'd know within minutes. If you're a National Security Council official, as I was, you'd know within minutes. Or you'd be in the meeting. Having a one-on-one meeting that went on for 2 hours, that covered all of these sensitive subjects, and people don't know. His director of national intelligence said in Aspen he didn't know what happened in those meetings days after the meetings occurred. This is diplomatic malpractice.
Dan Coates apologized for laughing out loud when he found out that the president had scheduled a new summit with Vladimir Putin.
Well, it was a nervous laugh. But he also said on the record that he did not know what happened in the Helsinki meetings.
What's the consequence of that?
Well, you don't have a functioning government when the government doesn't know, when the national security team and the national security apparatus doesn't know what the president's up to in negotiations with an enemy state. Anything can happen. It's a dysfunctional government.
You know Vladimir Putin. You've watched him for years. What does he make of the president's performance over the last 7 days, since he walked out of that summit?
No, Vladimir Putin loves it. I said the other day that if the president of the United States were a controlled asset of Vladimir Putin, he would act no differently than he does.
Do you think he actually is, though?
No, I have no idea whether or not he is. But look at what he does. If he were a controlled asset of Vladimir Putin, what would he do differently? He's doing everything to enhance the Russian agenda.
The president will say, well, I cracked down on Germany for trying to reach a natural gas deal.
What he's trying to do, what Putin's been trying to do for decades, and what Trump appears to be trying to do, is break up the NATO alliance, which the United States created, which is one of our greatest assets. If you think of what are our national security assets, NATO's at the top of the list. It's an incredible asset. It's the best political military alliance in the history of man.
President also overnight once again said that the entire notion of the Russian attack on the 2016 presidential election, he once again called it a big hoax.
Yeah, and he said that talking about the intelligence court materials that were made public. Very bad precedent. We've never released intelligence court materials before. Now we have a legal precedent that those documents can be released. That'll make it more difficult for us to do counterintelligence, more difficult for us to do counterterrorism. But the documents are out, and if you read them, they contradict the president.
How?
They say specifically that the FBI had good reason to worry about Carter Page. He was meeting with Russian intelligence agents. And you can guess that in the parts of the material that are blacked out, what we have there, I would guess, and I've seen a lot of these warrants, is intercepts of those Russian intelligence agents reporting back to Moscow on their conversation with Carter Page.
If Carter Page did do something illegal, would he not have been arrested by now?
It's not necessarily illegal to meet with Russian intelligence agents. It's what you do after the fact that could be illegal.
And one other thing, and we haven't had a chance to talk about this yet, if you look at the applications, the original applications and the 4 reapplications or extensions for the FISA warrant, they kept on getting longer.
And 4 different judges on 4 different occasions approved these warrants, saying that Carter Page might be a risk. All 4 of those Republican judges, and they were all appointed by Republican presidents, all 4 of those judges saw material that convinced them that Carter Page could be a counterintelligence risk.
And again, each time it gets longer, you're